I think that there's a human impulse to romanticize and to play up certain aspects of our past and to downplay others. And we do this on an individualized level, and things get just kind of disproportionate over time. And that's one of the reasons why what you and I do is so important. It's because what we do is we take people back into a moment and we try to show them the ambivalences and the ambiguities and the day-to-day difficulties. I've always thought that biography needs to do, well, a lot of things, but two things that it has to do is it has to show you why the person you've written about is special and extraordinary and exceptional, but at the same time, how that person is us.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining this event in the American Inspiration Author Series. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us tonight in the land of American history, looking at our country's cultural legacy, the Civil War, and its repercussions. I'm Margaret Talcott, the producer of literary programs at American Ancestors, New England Historic Genealogical Society, and part of its Brew Learning Center. It's a true honor to introduce tonight's guests, our featured author, John Matteson, and our guest moderator, Debby Applegate. First, John, his official bio. John Matteson received the Pulitzer Prize for Biography for Eden's Outcasts, the story of Louisa May Alcott and her father. For his work, The Lives of Margaret Fuller, he received the Anne M. Sperber Prize. John is a distinguished professor of English at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City and the editor of the annotated Little Women. And now, the official background on our moderator. Debby Applegate won the Pulitzer Prize for Biography in 2007 for her first book, The Most Famous Man in America, the biography of Henry Ward Beecher. Her second book, Madam, the biography of Polly Adler, icon of the jazz age, will be published this coming September, so don't miss that. Debby holds a PhD in American Studies from Yale University. Welcome also to our partners and our friends at Porter Square Books, who are in with us on so many of these great book events. I have not finished yet reading John's beautifully written history, but I can tell you so far it's very much a story of families, as well as the story of the Civil War and beyond. It's a personal tale touching on the lives of fathers and sons, family expectations and idealism, brothers and sisters, hopes and dreams. It is really, truly enjoyable to read. And it's no surprise that the book and John himself are greatly acclaimed. With that, John, over to you. Let's get started.
Margaret, thank you so much for that introduction, and I really could not be happier to be here this evening with you and with this sensational audience. One of the qualities that I love most about biography is that it is constantly rejiggering my understanding of history. I know many of your listeners and viewers are listening from Boston, and of course, it was a great Bostonian, Tip O'Neill, who was famous for saying that all politics is local. I think it's equally important to observe that all history is personal. There's a way of thinking about the past that, of course, concerns itself with large forces and mass movements, and we need that understanding. But something interesting happens when we tighten the focus and start thinking on the level of individual experience. And biography is wonderful for that, obviously. And it helps us to see beyond the categories that historians and librarians may impose for the sake of clarity and order. And what I try to do in my book is to shift the typical historical perspective in a couple of important ways. The first shift is away from the natural tendency to think of a battle solely in terms of its strategic importance. Of course, a battle by definition is a military action, but I wanted to see what would happen if I asked a different question about the Civil War Battle of Fredericksburg. And that question is, what if we were to view that battle in terms of its cultural impact? How did the future of the country change in terms of its law, in terms of its literature, in terms of its popular mythology, because that battle took place? The second shift is, as I've hinted, from the general to the specific and the personal. A Worse Place Than Hell still talks a fair bit about what regiment did what and where, but the principal focus is on how the battle looked and felt to certain representative individuals. An army chaplain picking up a rifle and crossing the Rappahannock River under fire, a Confederate artillery officer blazing away with a single cannon at a third of the Union Army, a young Pennsylvania blacksmith charging the stone wall at Fredericksburg with wounded soldiers clutching at his pant leg and urging him not to go forward. Paradoxically, writing about a battle, this dreadful, cataclysmic event, can actually end up being a little bit dull if all you find yourself saying is, and then the 27th Indiana advanced 600 yards. Um, but a biographical approach enables you to break through the conventions and the cliches of military writing and gives you some life and some immediacy in that scene. So why is the book called what it's called? The title, A Worse Place Than Hell, is drawn from something that Abraham Lincoln said, a lament that he uttered in despair after the battle, which was a disaster for the Union forces. He said to a friend, "If there's a worse place than hell, I'm in it." As some of you may already know, the book, however, is focused on 5 people whose lives were transformed by Fredericksburg. The future legal scholar and Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., John Pelham, the only Southerner and a member of the Army of Northern Virginia, led by Robert E. Lee, the poet Walt Whitman, a chaplain in the Union Army, Arthur B. Fuller, and finally, Louisa May Alcott, the future author of Little Women. So that's the order in which they enter the book, and that's how I intend to introduce them now. And I know we have some slides to go with this. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. was the most purely aristocratic of the 5 people I'm talking about. His father actually coined the term Boston Brahmin to refer to New England's intellectual elite. Now, when the war breaks out, Wendell is 20. He's just past his 20th birthday, and he's months away from graduating from Harvard. His life thus far has been privileged and comfortable. It's also been greatly influenced by his having a famous father. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. was a huge deal in his own right. He was a best-selling novelist and a poet. He was a professor of anatomy at the Harvard Medical School. The younger Holmes is ambitious. He stands fitfully in his father's shadow, and he yearns to surpass him, both in achievement and in fame. The younger Holmes goes off to war eagerly, but battle by battle, as he sees his friends killed and as he is wounded on 3 separate occasions, he has his romantic illusions shattered. But at the same time, his father is sitting back at home, becoming very involved from a patriotic point of view, waxing ever more romantic about the war and writing poems and speeches urging the North to sacrifice everything for victory, down to the last woman and child if necessary. So the generational clash between father and son becomes very complex, becomes very bitter. When Oliver Jr. is wounded in battle, his father drops everything and he travels across several states in an effort to find him. And yet, Holmes Sr. wonders aloud whether another, or he actually wonders this aloud to another famous senior, Henry James, father of the novelist, why is it that his son despises him? Wendell's experiences at Fredericksburg and beyond compel him to think very hard about various issues, above all, perhaps the limits of duty. Just how far should one extend the obligations that a person owes to his society? Holmes decided that the requirements of duty were not infinite, and his most important work as a legal scholar, a book called The Common Law, helped to define the idea of duty, which is a key concept in American jurisprudence. The war also persuaded Holmes that the great questions were more often decided by force than by reasonableness and persuasion. He becomes a believer not in moral certainties, but in practical probabilities. And so ironically, one of the greatest thinkers about American law stands convinced about the lawlessness of the universe. I mentioned earlier my one Southerner, and here he is, John Pelham. He is the only professional soldier out of the five. And you see in this picture just how very young he is. Like Holmes, he is also in his last year of college when the war begins. He's a fifth-year cadet at West Point. After Alabama secedes and his Southern classmates start to vanish, Pelham tries very hard to stay in school. He really wants his diploma, but the war comes and he's forced to leave without it. Now, he was a below average student at West Point, just above the bottom third. But when he gets into the war, he displays an uncanny ability as an artillery tactician, so remarkably so that the famous cavalryman Jeb Stuart builds an entire unit around him, known as the Stuart Horse Artillery. And at Fredericksburg, Pelham shows both technical mastery and extraordinary courage. He was actually the officer I mentioned at the top of my remarks, who holds off a third of the Union Army for about an hour using only one cannon. It's extraordinary. And Pelham has fascinated me for a very, very long time, in part as kind of the quintessential um, great hero in a terrible cause. He's handsome, he's athletic, he's modest, he's a model soldier. And yet at the same time, he's also an enthusiastic secessionist who never seems to have the first qualm about the fact that he's defending the institution of slavery. So for me, he's a very tragic figure, this upright young man on the wrong side of history, admirable for everything but his political loyalties, and those loyalties end up destroying him. For some people, Pelham becomes the perfect Confederate martyr. He's a figure who, if you look at him long enough, you almost start to believe that the war was not so horrible and that it was courtly and glorious. He becomes, for Civil War enthusiasts, the stuff of legend. But as my book tries to show, legends are not always benign. Um, as Margaret mentioned at the start, one of the themes that appears over and over again in my book is the motif of family. I have 5 major storylines. 3 of them involve, at one point or another, searches for a lost or endangered relative who's been caught up in the fighting. I've already mentioned the Holmeses, and there's a parallel to be found in the experience of Whitman, who learns that his brother George, a Union officer, has been wounded in one of the desperate charges below the stone wall at Fredericksburg. So Walt drops everything, he dashes to the battlefield, and where he finds not only his wounded brother, but the human wreckage of countless young men. Now, up to this point, Whitman has not been able to think of an adequate position for himself in the war. But while he's at Fredericksburg, he experiences what I would call a kind of conversion. Instead of going back to his life in New York, which he could easily have done, he rents a room in Washington and he gets a low-level government job for a pittance. And then he spends almost the rest of the war tending to the sick and wounded in the Army hospitals. It's a remarkable display of kindness, of compassion. It's as heroic in its own way, I think, as any exploit on the Civil War battlefields. Now, Whitman's time in Washington kindles his fascination with President Abraham Lincoln, and it makes it possible for Whitman to write what many consider his greatest poem, the elegy he writes after Lincoln's murder, called "When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed." Before he went to look for George, Walt had reached a period of stagnation and depression in his life, a time that he looked back on as what he called his quicksand years. The war, surprisingly, rescues and redeems him. He discovers in himself levels of generosity and of love that he probably never knew that he had. And we know, of course, that more than probably any other single volume, Whitman's book, Leaves of Grass, sets the tone for modern American poetry. Now, Whitman has published 3 editions of Leaves of Grass, each larger than the last before the Civil War. But he himself insisted that the true Leaves of Grass would never have been written if it had not been for his experience of war. And that experience happens because of the Battle of Fredericksburg. Now, the most obscure member of the book's quintet you see before you, and that's Arthur B. Fuller. Fuller was a Unitarian minister. He goes to war as the chaplain of the 16th Massachusetts Infantry. And like Holmes, Fuller comes from a very prominent family. His father has been a 4-term congressman and a friend of President John Quincy Adams. But the overshadowing presence in Arthur's family is his late older sister, Margaret Fuller, a leading advocate for women's rights and the foremost American female intellectual of her day. Arthur grows up with a lot of expectations, which he finds difficult to meet. And he also lives with a disability. He had an accident when he was 10 that deprived him of the sight in one eye. He's a frail man and he's prone to debilitating headaches. And up until the war, he's never lived the life of action and self-assertion that he has craved. When the war comes and he signs on as a chaplain, he goes in with a series of missions. He is fighting for the Union and for abolition. He's also trying to guard and to promote the moral uprightness, the religious virtue of the men in his regiment. But perhaps above all, he's trying to capture and to reclaim his own compromised, unfulfilled manhood. And Fuller's moment of crisis comes at Fredericksburg. He's been weakened by malaria. He's just received a medical discharge and he's preparing to leave the army. But he's unable to leave now that a fight is coming and he knows that men he knows will be in danger. He slips away from his own regiment because he knows that his own men would recognize him. He puts on an officer's coat and joins another regiment, which is one of the first to go across the river, the Rappahannock River, into the streets of Fredericksburg, where there is a fierce street battle. He declares, I must do something for my country. He shoulders a musket and he does the best that he can to defend the Union. And you'll see here a contemporary illustration of that street fight, that door-to-door fighting that was really unprecedented in American history. And this battle, which is kind of the prelude to the larger battle, is the defining moment in Arthur Fuller's life. Now, Fuller's direct impact on American history is not as great as that of the other 4 major figures in the book. I include him in part as a meditation on courage and its more unexpected forms. He does, however, influence America in an unexpected way, not so much through his actions as through his DNA. Those of you in the audience who are really on top of this stuff may know that the B of his middle name stands for Buckminster. And indeed, Arthur Fuller, chaplain at Fredericksburg, was the paternal grandfather of the great inventor, architect, and futurist, Buckminster Fuller. As those of you who've read my previous work will certainly know, the last of the 5 is by no means the least in my regard. You're looking at Louisa May Alcott, the future author of Little Women. Alcott, like most of the book's other heroes, is eager to get into the war. In fact, she says she openly wishes that she could be a man so that she could go immediately off and fight. But she has to wait. In part because of the bias against her sex, which imposes a barrier, but she even has to wait to get in as a nurse. And the reason for that is that the head of the Union Army Nursing Corps, Dorothea Dix, refuses to employ any woman under the age of 30 because she had this fear that eligible maidens would come to her hospitals and comb them in search of slightly damaged husbands. She doesn't want that. Alcott turns 30 just 2 weeks before Fredericksburg. She sends in her application without delay. She receives her orders, and she's actually on her way to Washington as the Battle of Fredericksburg is unfolding. Now, up to this time, Alcott has been a moderately successful writer. She's turned out melodramatic stories for the popular press for a few dollars here and there, but she has yet either to find a broad literary audience or a voice in her writing that truly suits her. Now, at the hospital, she meets a gravely wounded man. His name is John Surrey, a young Pennsylvanian who has never been in a battle before Fredericksburg. He is wounded at the close of day on the very last of the series of mad, useless charges against that stone wall that I've already mentioned. You see an illustration of that charge here. You can see in the middle distance Surrey's division commander, A. Humphreys, on horseback, urging his men forward. A bullet during this charge passes through Surrey's lung, producing a slow, mortal wound. Everything about John Surrey fascinates and moves Louisa May Alcott. She says that he has a man's nobility, a heart as warm and tender as a woman's, and a nature as fresh and frank as any child. So he is the best of masculine, feminine, and juvenile in her eyes. Surrey dies the day after Christmas, 1862. Alcott herself falls deathly ill soon after and has to leave her post at the hospital after only 6 weeks. But she remembers John Surrey, and she uses his story as the centerpiece of the book that really puts her on the map, a book of experiences nursing in the war called Hospital Sketches. It's her first big commercial success. More importantly, as she herself observed, the book teaches her her true style and persuades her that she can write effectively about incidents drawn from her own life rather than just from her fertile but lurid imagination. Hospital Sketches also catches the eye of an editor, Thomas Niles. And 4 years later, it's Niles who will remember this book when he asks Alcott to write a book for girls. And that book, as you could guess, is Little Women. It's the oldest book in the canon of American children's literature. It's been cited as an early inspiration by women as diverse as Carson McCullers, Hillary Clinton, Annie Leibovitz, Patti Smith, more internationally, Simone de Beauvoir, and the current Empress of Japan. So that, in as much of a nutshell as I can give it, is a brief overview of A Worse Place Than Hell. It's probably not the best practice to quote one's own reviews, but I did want to mention one because it says something interesting about the book. It calls it, and I'm quoting, John Matteson's personal pledge of allegiance. And whether I meant it to be or not, I think that's true. I regard this book as at least partially an homage to our great conflicted nation, a nation that has to be understood both from a critical point of view, but also sympathetically. And for me, always with the deepest and most complex affection.
I'm coming in. Sorry, I'm still new to the Zooming. Thanks thanks for inviting me to be here. It is an honor to be here. And it is also a source of envy because you write so beautifully. Everything you do is so eloquent and so sensitive and yet so suspenseful. And I would even say fast paced for a book that's also about ideas. So I guess if I might start from my own point of view, I would like to dive under the beautiful surface and ask you about the process of writing something that is both so far reaching and also so intimate. I know that many people in our audience are very involved in family genealogy, and genealogists, even amateur genealogists, like historians, have to take small, sometimes very obscure little pieces of information, fragments of knowledge, a draft card, a letter, a census entry, and then try to piece them into larger stories. You do this really magnificently. Can you tell us a little bit about how you approach that challenge? Because I know other people are thinking about the same issues.
Sure. The reason that I wrote this book is that it brings together for me a series of interests that I've had really almost throughout my life. I became interested in the Civil War when I was just a kid, and I developed a really early fascination actually with John Pelham. But sort of each person in this book sort of draws on a particular episode in my life. I used to practice law, so I was interested in Holmes, and I've written about Arthur Fuller's sister Margaret in a previous book, and so forth. As far as the tracking down of the information, I was really very fortunate with this book in that there are rich archives for really 4 out of the 5 figures, and the one that doesn't fall under that is Pelham, and I'll mention him in a second. But the Fuller family papers at the Houghton Library at Harvard are just luxuriant. And they cover not only Arthur, but also his famous father, Timothy, and his mega famous sister, Margaret. And so those papers they're tremendously revelatory, and they're really a joy to work one's way through. And a similar thing can be said about the Alcotts. Their papers are also at the Houghton. And Louisa's father, Bronson, kept detailed journals from the time that he was 26. And he also kept scrapbooks. And he kept locks of people's hair. So you can be, flipping through these scrapbooks and suddenly you'll see Louisa's hair, things like that. So it's a really exciting, intimate experience. And then almost literally every scrap that Walt Whitman scribbled a laundry list on has been preserved and published, which makes it very easy indeed. And ditto Oliver Wendell Holmes. I wish that he had kept more journals and written a few more letters, but they were all just really kind of pliant in that sense. The one who wasn't was Pelham, because, and as a fellow biographer, I can anticipate your groan when I say this. But in the 1920s, there was some fellow who wanted to write a biography of Pelham, and he borrowed John Pelham's letters from the Civil War years and lost them. And they've never resurfaced. And so where Pelham is concerned, a lot of what I did, had to be kind of, from the outside looking in, what other people wrote about him, and the letters that he wrote up to the Civil War, which are still available. But there were fascinating tidbits in the Pelham archive too. I went down to Alabama, and Debbie, I think you'll probably love this. There is in the box in one of these libraries a book that Pelham's father gave him about how a young man should behave at college. And there is a passage about, shall we gently call it, self-abuse. And the author of the book says, this is too delicate of a subject even to address in English. I will write it in Latin. And Pelham's father writes in the margin, heed well this Latin, boy. And so anyway, it's not really what one necessarily expects, but I fell over when I found
I'm sure he passed that book around at West Point, so dirty parts.
Well, he was, he was at the same time a very upstanding young man, and he's the only person I have read about, though I suppose there are others, who was given demerits at West Point for reading the Bible after lights out. Okay.
Wow.
This is his idea of transgressing, right? Having the light on under the covers, reading scripture. So
he's really, to my mind, one of the most interesting characters here, even though of course he's the one who dies young and we know so little about, partially because he's a great character to consider in the context of our current cultural debates, where we are quite concerned now, and I think rightly so, with the conundrum of really, how do we think about good people who do bad things, or conversely, bad people who do great things? And it's a question that has risen to the surface probably for a variety of reasons now, and one that I don't think most people have a good way of thinking about. They just know that something doesn't feel right, and he's a perfect character. You talk about that quite explicitly in your book. And what could you say about that would help those of us who are thinking about these issues now?
Yeah, sure. I think that if you're reading history and everything feels right, you're probably not reading enough. Because we know from our own lives that that life is not tidy. That there are people, and we do this ourselves. We present ourselves as one thing when we are privately another. We give lip service sometimes to virtues that we don't necessarily practice. And we have a tendency, when we look at history, to want to hold people to a very high standard of conduct. It saddens and harms us in a way when we think about Thomas Jefferson owning slaves, or I could go down the list of kind of tarnished heroes. And yet at the same time, there's this impulse that we have kind of to build up a hero and then knock them down. And I could give you tons of examples of that. So there is a sort of yin and yang, and there's a sort of inhale and exhale of history, where we'll bring someone up to the top of the mountain, and then inevitably we'll have to bring them down the slope and put someone else up there. And I think it's important to preserve a sense of humility and a sense of humanity when you're reading and thinking about history, and to be honest with yourself about how you would behave, how you would react if you lived under a slaveholding regime or a totalitarian regime that was constantly sending you messages that if you stood outside, you would regard very differently from how you see them from within. That doesn't mean you go around defending everybody. There are historical figures who utterly deserve our condemnation, and 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 obviously the institution of slavery demands our condemnation. But these were people who experienced love, tasted grief, lived lives, and as such, uh, lived in an atmosphere of endless complication, and many of them just made it for themselves the best that they could. So that's my best shot at that, Debbie.
And I guess when I finished your book, I was thinking about the romanticization of the Civil War, and I know uh, in the South there is, a certain kind of romanticization of the lost cause. In the North, there is a certain kind of self-congratulation.
Yeah,
But even as the North, and I count myself as a Northerner, uh, we can be very self-congratulatory in ways that are not historically accurate,
sure.
but it doesn't seem like we have the same romantic legacy. We don't still orient ourselves in the same way as a cultural region towards the war that the South does. And I know some of that is because it occurred much more on Southern soil, but is there something else going on there? And or maybe I'm wrong. Do we in fact we in the North romanticize the war, just in different, more diffuse ways?
Yeah, before I answer that, Debbie, I don't want the hour to go by without saying how excited I am about the book that you're about to publish.
Okay, that's
It's I've read portions of it. Madam, the life of Polly Adler, icon of the Jazz Age. It is engrossing and exciting from page one, and coming out this fall from Doubleday, I think, and good on you, really.
thanks for the plug. Thanks for
Oh,
the
it's fantastic. But anyway, instead of saying the subject was roses, the subject was romance. Walt Whitman said that the real war would never get into the books. And people have kicked back and forth. Well, what was it that he really was saying when he said that the war would never get into the books? But I think that Whitman was savvy enough to know about this tendency to gloss over and to romanticize and to justify post hoc and so forth. And you one of the most interesting figures as far as that goes is Oliver Wendell Holmes, who goes through hell in this war. He's wounded 3 times. Every one of his friends is killed or maimed. It's an absolute horror show. But 30 years later, when he gives speeches about the war, he talks about how beautiful it was to take part in these battles, and to go potentially to one's death under orders that one could not understand, and for a cause that one was not entirely sure of. I think that there's a human impulse to romanticize and to play up certain aspects of our past and to downplay others. And we do this on an individualized level, and things get just kind of disproportionate over time. And that's one of the reasons why what you and I do is so important. It's because what we do is we take people back into a moment, and we try to show them the ambivalences and the ambiguities and the day-to-day difficulties. I've always thought that biography needs to do, well, a lot of things, but two things that it has to do is it has to show you why the person you've written about is special and extraordinary and exceptional, but at the same time, how that person is us, right? So there's this sense of distance and maybe admiration or maybe contempt, but also there has to be identification, which is something that you did so greatly with Henry Ward Beecher, that you've done again now. I don't know of a better kind of writing. I'm so glad that I ended up doing biographies.
I'm going to turn it to some of the questions we're getting. We're getting a lot of terrific questions on all different aspects of this. I'm going to start with this one because this is terrific. Of those who are featured in your book, who survived the Civil War, whose life trajectory was most altered by their experiences here at Fredericksburg, in your opinion?
Okay. So at the risk of spoilers, Arthur Fuller and John Pelham don't make it. So the three who do are Holmes Jr., Alcott, and Whitman. And as to whose life is altered most, I would rate it a toss-up between Holmes and Alcott. The reason being that Whitman has already written many of his great poems by the time that the war begins. He transforms as a poet. A lot of people feel the poetry he writes after, in the main isn't as good. I don't really agree with that necessarily, because I do think it's a humanizing experience for him to be surrounded by the sick and the wounded, and something that really kind of shows him an aspect of humanity that has been missing from his poetry. But the reason that I say Alcott and Holmes is that they still have their lives ahead of them. That if you stopped the film in 1861, Holmes would just be the son of a great poet, and Louisa or Alcott would really be just the daughter of a kind of funky, transcendental kind of hippie philosopher. They are deeply shaped and molded by this experience. Alcott, because, as I mentioned in my talk, it shows her style, and it shows her that she can write about real life rather than just doing these pot-boiler, bodice-ripping melodramas. And we would never have had Little Women or any of her subsequent career without her having been in the hospitals, having written hospital sketches and so forth. And ditto Holmes. He's young, he's unformed, and this war forms him. He says that the people who went through it were touched with fire. And what that fire does to him is it strips him of all of his romantic inclinations. He enters the war having read Sir Philip Sidney from the court of the great Queen Elizabeth, and how courtly and how romantic the war is going to be, don't you know? And as I mentioned in my talk, he becomes vividly aware that life is shaped by things we'd rather not think about, by force, by blood, by iron, rather than the kind of rational, dégagé, conversations that he's had at dear old Harvard. Okay. And so his life just does almost a 180 in terms of its philosophies. And you see that in the skepticism that underlies his legal work.
And of course, he lasts till he doesn't retire from the Supreme Court till he's 90, right? Is that
Oh
correct?
my goodness. Yeah, he's still on the court when Franklin Roosevelt, well, I guess he actually retires while Hoover is still president, but he dies under the Franklin Roosevelt administration. If you've seen the 1933 Little Women movie with Katharine Hepburn, I don't know if he saw it or not, but he was still alive to do it if he was inclined to. So he outdistances everyone else in this book by 40 years, which is incredible because, on like page 2 of my book, he gets a bullet through the neck.
Right. I saw that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but he's just made out of barbed wire.
I gotta ask a few. This is a question that I don't know anything about, but I'm dying to hear what your answer is. Somebody mentions that their great grandfather fought in the Battle of Fredericksburg and served in the 28th Regiment of the New Jersey Volunteers, and up the first wave of the hill.
Mhm.
Do you know that you, as a Princeton boy, you must know a thing or two about that?
Well, and I just happen to know a few things about that regiment, the 28th New Jersey. They were what was called a 9-month regiment. In other words, they were not the hard-bitten veterans who signed up in 1861 and went straight through to Appomattox. These were people who, may have signed up for financial reasons to get a bonus, or who knows? But what's interesting about the 28th New Jersey, and this is true also of the regiment whom Louisa May Alcott's soldier was from. Fredericksburg was the only battle that the 28th fought in. And so imagine this, you're signed up for 9 months. Your life is basically pretty boring, except for this one day where you are just put on the conveyor belt to the wood chipper, and that is your war. And in fact, there was a soldier in the 28th New Jersey who wrote about that charge later, and he said that it was a great wonder that that charge did not kill all of them. And also the 28th was in the same division as Whitman's brother. So anyway, 28th New Jersey person, you now can impress your friends with the fact that that your ancestor went into battle with Walt Whitman's brother. So have fun with that.
One of the other questions is about they have a relative who was a deserter who sort of disappears off the face of the earth with his desertion. He doesn't try to get any veterans benefits. He moved to another state. We don't know as much about deserters of the war. They aren't talked about as much. What do you have to say? Is there anything to say that's about that seems especially relevant to what you've written here?
Yeah, I'm seeing in the chat that that this person really would like some guidance, and it sounds as if the trail is pretty cold, that they only know the first name or his chosen first name, and you can go to a state archive. Often you can find things there. It really helps a lot if you can find out what regiment they were in. That opens a lot of doors. When I started work on this book, thinking of John Surrey, all of the information I had about him was wrong. Louisa in her, and I call her Louisa because we've been friends since like 2002, but so she won't mind. But and to distinguish her from the other Alcotts, but anyway, Louisa in her diary and in her other published material on Surrey says that he was a 30-year-old Virginia blacksmith. And 2/3 of that is wrong. He was a blacksmith, but he was 21 and he was from Pennsylvania. And I just discovered that by happenstance. Somebody's asking about the musical instruments.
That's what you got to. You finish this because
Sorry.
well, you're telling this. The thing about discovering that 2/3 of what you were going to write is wrong, and you only discover it by accident is a nightmare that most historians have had once or twice. And I'm sure the minute I publish my book, I'll find out I was wrong about it.
Oh, Debbie, the Surrey misinformation threw everyone off the trail. Every single biographer of Louisa May Alcott, myself included, thought to themselves, well, she wouldn't be wrong about this. This is from the horse's mouth. But the fact is, you can never really, or almost never, be 100% sure. And so, yeah, everything that I've written thus far has had errors in it, despite all of the diligence, despite all of the meticulousness. We make assumptions as biographers, sometimes without even realizing we're making assumptions. The scary story about that for me was with Eden's Outcasts, going up to Concord, Massachusetts, because I love to go to the actual place, and seeing cardinals, the red birds, flitting about in the trees. I thought, oh, great detail for the book, The Cardinals of Concord. I'll throw it in. I do, and I get an email from an outraged ornithologist, no less, who says cardinals did not come to Concord until the 20th century, only because of global warming. You, sir, are a failure and a fraud, right?
Oh, yeah.
And, we fixed it in the paperback, but my goodness, these things.
It's the throwaway lines that get you, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, so many things to talk about there. I know we're getting a little close to the end. I would like to just add, well, two questions. First one is, I know you visited Fredericksburg, speaking of visiting the sites. Did that give you something that you wouldn't have had if you had not gone and seen it?
Oh, great question, Debbie. Fredericksburg is not as well preserved as many of the other major Civil War battlefields. And the reason for that is really commonsensical. The battle was fought in the streets of the town and also on the outskirts of it. And Fredericksburg, after the war, just kept growing. And so, now when you try to find the place where John Surrey fell, it's probably somebody's driveway. Which is a little bit of the battlefield's preserved. But what it does do is it gives you a sense of distances, for one thing. There's an embankment from the river that Arthur Fuller must have run up to get to the streets of the town. And I was there with a stopwatch, starting at the shore and running up just to see how many seconds that would take, and how long was the march to get up to the stone wall and things like that. So I do as much of that as I can. In fact, I even visited the battlefield on the anniversary of the battle because I wanted to know what the angle of the sun was toward the end of, were they squinting into the sunlight when they, of the fading sun? So yeah, I got some wonderful things out of it, not the least of which was meeting some of the people who work at that battlefield, because they're a sensational group. And I look forward to seeing them after COVID finally dies down.
Well, all that detailed work reminds me that I want to close before I get to the very last question, which is I do want to say thank you to all of the people who do this genealogical work. You think you're working just on your own family, but it's these little details that, just like John's talking about, that we as professional historians go to, and you have no idea how often you have made a contribution that doesn't necessarily show in the final product, but was a critical brick in building the project. So first of all, I just want to say thank you to the genealogists and the Genealogical Society. And I'm going to close with what I think is a fun question. Somebody wants to know, what are those musical instruments?
What are those musical instruments? I'm not a very accomplished musician at all, but I have a tremendous, I take tremendous delight in the music that I can make. And so what you see behind me are probably the necks of a number of electric guitars. There's a Fender Telecaster, a Fender Stratocaster, a PRS 24, which I'm really fond of. And I don't know if you can see it, but there's also an Epiphone Les Paul. And if this book goes well, I'm going to upgrade to a Gibson, but we'll see. So buy those copies now. And
he needs to feed his guitar addiction.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Such a fascinating conversation. I really, really enjoyed it. You guys have covered so much territory. We're so grateful. And I really think we could go on all evening, and we have folks in the chat saying, these are never long enough. And then you always get some, this was way too long. So it's hard to know. But with you two, I think we could have gone on a lot longer. But being respectful of everyone's time and dinner hour, I do want to move toward closing. First, with some final readings from the book, John has picked out 2 passages just for us. So John, go ahead with those.
Okay, great. And I hope this doesn't run too long. But we've mentioned, of course, that one of the themes of the book is family, and also the people who are interested in this organization tonight are people who are engaged often in search of family members long departed. So I thought it might be appropriate to read a little bit about Walt Whitman's search for his still living brother George in the days after the Battle of Fredericksburg. So here goes. The terse, hard-bitten Union General William Tecumseh Sherman harbored no illusions about the glories of warfare. I think we understand what military fame is, he wrote, to be killed on the field of battle and have our names spelled wrong in the newspapers. Sherman might have smiled grimly if he had been present on December 16th, 1862, as Walt Whitman scanned the New York Herald for news of the battle at Fredericksburg. On the last page of the paper, he found the list of casualties from the 51st New York. The names of the 10 dead and 58 wounded filled about a third of a column. Fourth from the bottom, Whitman saw a line that instantly changed his relation to the war, and that would, in time, transform his idea of himself, both as a person and as a poet. It read simply, First Lieutenant G.W. Whitmore, Company D. The Herald was mistaken as to the soldier's rank. The day before the attack on Marie's Heights, he had been promoted to captain, retroactive to November 1st. As to the nature and severity of the officer's injury, the paper was silent. The name, of course, was misspelled, but that error did not deceive Walt. His brother's letters had never mentioned a Whitmore among the officers of the 51st. The wounded man could only be George. Before the battle, George had signed his last letter goodbye, an unusual closing for him to use. Might he have had a premonition? No matter. In the moment Whitman read the listing of George Whitmore among the wounded, the inertia of his preceding months vanished. Walt Whitman of Manhattan, the Sun, was no longer adrift. Within hours, he had secured the help of Moses Lane, his brother Jeff's superior at the Brooklyn Waterworks, in obtaining a pass that authorized him to go to the front. The next day, Whitman was pounding the streets of Washington, looking for George. His passage to the capital had not gone without incident. As he was switching trains in Philadelphia, his mind set on other matters, Whitman had failed to notice a deft hand reaching into his pocket. The next time the poet searched for his money, it was gone. He had landed in a pretty situation, in a strange city, without a dime, and wholly ignorant of where to turn in search of his brother. With no money for car fare, with nothing but hope and chance to guide him, he did the only practical thing. He started walking. For 2 days and nights, he walked from hospital to hospital. He applied as well to officials in the government who he thought might help. His congressman, Moses Odell, would not so much as see him, and no one in the hospitals had any information. His interval of homelessness and worry seemed longer than it was. He called it about 3 days of the greatest suffering I ever experienced in my life. He trudged on. Finally, his luck turned. Evidently by chance, he ran into 2 of the men who had helped him in Boston with the printing of the 1860 Leaves of Grass. William O'Connor, who had taken a job in the Treasury, lent him some money. From Charles W. Eldridge, now with the Army Paymaster's Office, he secured passage to the encampments of Burnside's army at Falmouth, Virginia, where, heaven willing, he might find George. Down at the docks, he boarded a government boat which carried him downriver to Aquia Creek. Once there, he settled onto the train that took him to a place that even his broad imagination could never have conceived. He arrived at the perimeter of the battlefield on December 19th. The impressions of the place almost overpowered him. One of his first stops was at Chatham, where a few days earlier, General Burnside had scolded Winfield Scott Hancock for throwing cold water on his battle plan. The mansion was now a field hospital, its handsome floors of yellow pine now stained with blood. Outside, no more than 10 yards from the door that looked out over the Rappahannock to the town of Fredericksburg beyond, 2 ancient catalpa trees still stand, their stark shapes weathered and twisted by time. They were there in 1862, and near the foot of one of them, Whitman happened on an appalling sight. The surgeons inside the house used the tree as a dumping site for severed limbs. The poet found himself gazing at, quote, a heap of amputated feet, legs, arms, and hands, unquote. Not just a few, but, quote, a full load for a one-horse cart, unquote. Nearby lay several corpses, each of which had received a small, spare dignity of a brown woolen blanket. The path leading to the house now led past an array of freshly dug graves, most of them belonging to officers, the names hastily scratched onto barrel staves or broken boards that had been jammed into the dirt. Chatham was hardly a tranquil scene, yet strangely, what Whitman remembered about it was its quiet at least when compared with the deafening roar of the previous week. Whitman had missed all that, of course, yet somehow he seemed to hear it. Probably, he wrote, the earth never shook by artificial means or the air reverberated more than on that winter daybreak of 8 or 9 days since. Surprisingly, despite all the travail and fretfulness that preceded it, Whitman seems never to have noted in writing exactly when or where he discovered George. As to his own thoughts when Whitman slouched into view, George was equally silent. Presumably, he was surprised, having had no notice that Walt was on his way. But what mattered was that George was alive and well. Oh, you may imagine, Whitman wrote his mother, how trifling all my little cares and difficulties seemed. They vanished into nothing. And then I have just a couple more paragraphs. This is from the beginning of the chapter that deals with John Pelham's last battle. And we talked, Debbie and I talked about the importance of actually going to the sites that you write about to try to absorb the atmosphere. And that's actually a lot easier to do in the area of Virginia where John Pelham breathed his last. And so these are just a couple of paragraphs that I wrote on a foggy morning at Kelly's Ford, Virginia. Broad, immaculate horse farms now blanket the terrain near Kelly's Ford, Virginia, and the mist lies low and heavy in the early mornings over the Rappahannock, a little less than 30 miles above Fredericksburg. It is a place even today of surpassing tranquility. Its only notes of restlessness are sounded by a steady drone of crickets and the eager honks of wild geese on the move. There is a piety in quiet places. On St. Patrick's Day, 1863, the war came to Kelly's Ford, though not with the sustained operatic fury with which it had swept through the West Woods or down from Marie's Heights. Its fields became the scene of a brief but bitter skirmish, pitting about 800 of Jeb Stuart's cavalrymen, led by Fitzhugh Lee, Robert E. Lee's nephew, against a much larger force under Brigadier General William Woods Averill. The word skirmish suggests a sharp but fleeting hornet's nest affair, quickly arising and quickly ending. A skirmish attracts no great remembrance, no information centers, no park rangers, no detailed markers to tell the visitor it was here. One must be satisfied with a numbered sign by the side of a road on which a dozen lines suffice to tell of the struggles, triumphs, and tragedies of unnamed men. But no place where life has been risked and taken should be considered trivial.
John, that was beautiful and so meaningful. And as someone who's tried to find where the battle was, driving through Fredericksburg, your take on this is is better. So thank you. And I just really thank you so much, both of you, for not letting us forget the place and the families and the history that's there. So this has been a really special evening. Thank you. If you yourself are researching American history, a family, a place, a time, our research library might be of use to you. Although the stacks are currently closed because of the pandemic, our virtual doors are wide open. You can visit our digital archives of town and church records, diaries, journals, family books. For further intel, connect with one of our genealogists online at americanancestors.org, where you will find educational resources from the Brew Family Learning Center, including upcoming free events such as this one and videos of past author talks, educational programs. Even in this pandemic, our mission is to educate, inspire, and to connect people. We wish all of you at home a very safe and inspirational evening, and we'll see you back here soon again. Thank you and good night from Boston, from New Haven, and from New York. We will see you very soon.